Chapter 10 Why Not Try God is one of those phrases that people say as if you accepting their theology, trying out their spiritual practice, will make the difference. Other than that, you are of their type of churchy. Some time ago, a moving picture actress took to preaching. Mary Pickford wrote a little book entitled Why Not Try God, which rated for a considerable period as a bestseller. This chapter is in no way a review of that book. I've merely appropriated its title, and I'm glad to acknowledge a debt of inspiration. Now, see, even in spiritual books, the word inspiration loses a lot of its strength by not having it like, okay, the prophets were inspired, and then they spoke, then they expressed those principles in their own words. I guess that's as easy of a way as one can say. Revealed as, it is the word of God explicitly, Provoked is different than inspiration. In her book, the author describes a great secret, but it is not a new secret. In fact, it is very old. It is new only to him who finds it for the first time. The writer of the book of Psalms found it long ago. My expectation, he declared, is from him, which is to say, with childlike faith, that he expected God to do for him what needed to be done. Why not try God? Why not indeed? You who have a great burden upon your heart, you have tried many other devices for relief. You have sought elsewhere for the balm of Gilead and for heart ease. Why not try God? You who are out of work and are worried and anxious, why not try God? You who are morally weak, you have sought elsewhere for strength and found it not. Why not try God? You who have sorrow and are acquainted with grief, upon whom rests the heavy weight of affliction, you find little help in the world to take that ache out of your heart. Why not try God? Here is a joyous fact. Whatsoever your problem, it can be solved. Whatsoever your burden, it can be lightened. Whatsoever your sorrow, it can be assuaged. Whatsoever your anxiety, it can be relieved. Whatsoever your sin, it can be cleansed and forgiven. Doubtless, most of us have prayed to God more or less earnestly. We have made feeble and sporadic attempts to lay hold of the divine resources, but our efforts have been largely futile. The real question is, have we ever wholeheartedly, sincerely, and insistently tried God? Nearly everybody believes in God, to some degree at least. The number of 100% thoroughgoing atheists has always been small. It's a lot smaller than people say. It's a phrase, oh, they believe in God, they just don't believe, they're deists, perhaps. Not a few who are philosophical atheists in the daytime become practical theists at night when darkness falls. We believe God can do all things. We have seen evidences of it in many lives. We know that some have tried him and have found it worthwhile, but have we ever actually tried him for ourselves? Many of us are like Dr. Manette, about whom Dickens weaves a wistful story in his novel, A Tale of Two Cities. The doctor had been in prison for 20 years prior to the French Revolution, which freed him. In prison, he learned the trade of a cobbler, and in the gloom of a cell, spent his days tapping shoes. Finally, the day came when he was offered his liberty and let out into the sunlight, but freedom terrified him. He had been too long in the shadows of a cell, and had grown in his soul to love it. Accordingly, a trusted servant was given the duty of locking him at night in an attic room about the size of his old cell. And there, through the lattice work, he could be seen in a twilight gloom, tapping out shoes. Similarly, in the narrowness and weakness of our imprisoned lives, we are led to the very door of a liberty which, God help us, we are afraid to take. We are offered magnificent powers which we will not accept. God, with his illimitable resources, is at our personal disposal, yet we do not try him. The wise old psalmist, however, was not so. He said, "My expectation is from him." He expected help from God, and he found it. When one confidently expects God's aid, the great truth is there is no area of life where God cannot and will not tremendously help. How do I know this, you ask? Why am I so positive of it? This I know because of personal experience. God has helped me. To him I personally owe an everlasting debt of gratitude. I called upon him myself. I tried him myself and found him reliable. Beside my own personal testimony, I lay the experience of others whom I have known. As a Christian minister, I have myself seen God help people in a perfectly marvelous way. There is not the least shadow of a doubt about this fact in my mind. This is not a theory, but a glorious truth. Well, a theory is a working of truths. There are at least two reasons why people do not receive help from God. The first is that they really do not expect to, for their faith is weak. They pray more or less out of habit, or because it is the orthodox thing to do, or because, frankly, they do not know anything else to do. But they would be the most amazed people in the world if anything actually happened as a result of their prayers. They pray, but they do not believe it in their hearts. If, on the contrary, one out of a sense of great need asks God's help, and then goes out into life and lives on in the assumption that God will help, if the need is sincere and the faith is real, then I say he will help. If you are in great trouble or need, and you should come to me as a minister of religion, and I should say that God will help you if you will allow him, the chances are that you would go away disappointed and condemn me on the ground that I had nothing practical to offer you. As a matter of fact, if you try God with absolute expectation, you will find it overwhelmingly practical. First of all, it will do something to your own personality to have that sort of faith. It will make it stronger, unifying and drawing to a focus the powers which in your weakness are being dissipated. It will consolidate your powers so that God can work through you to help you help yourself. Even over and above that, however, in ways that are past finding out, experience through long centuries has demonstrated the irrefutable fact that man who lays his burdens absolutely and completely on the Lord will find that the entire universe is struggling to help him. And this fact I know to be true by the greatest of all tests, that of personal experience. Several years ago, I was the lone passenger in a chair car on a train traveling through central Ohio. A chair car, is that better than coach, or is that worse than coach? Or is that coach? For some time, I had been under great strain, which was drawing heavily upon my nerve strength. Worries and fears were haunting my days and disturbing my nights. To add further to my unhappiness, a profound sense of failure had cast a heavy pall upon my spirit. On that train, I was working on a sermon for the following Sunday upon the topic, the secret of power, and it suddenly occurred to me that the topic was ironical, for I certainly was not the possessor of power, and so what right had I to discern such a question? Years before, I had experienced the power of religion by conversion, which was in every sense real and valid. The force of that experience of God in my life had become seemingly, if not spent, at least reduced. I was now trying to get along on my own power. Well, any power or ability is only by permission of God, right? The vast force of God being neglected and unused. I ceased working on the sermon and in desperation of spirit, bowed my head in prayer. Now I have prayed since childhood, but my experience has been like that of Lowell, as it portrayed in the cathedral. Now, what did Lowell portray in the cathedral? I who still pray at morning and at eve, loving those roots that bind us to the past, and prizing more than Plato things I learned. At that best academy, a mother's knee, thrice in my life, perhaps, have truly prayed, thrice stirred below my conscious self, have felt that perfect disenthrallment which is God. And in a way, a person can live a spiritual life for the occasional experience. But if you truly pray, then it's not just an occasional experience. So, in my little prayer, the wonder happened. In a moment of illumination, like a sudden flash of lightning on a dark night, revealing in a clarity a hitherto hidden landscape, so I saw into the secret of spiritual power. But more importantly, even than that, was that I felt under me a vast power like a great incoming tide, which lifts a stranded vessel from the shallows. It was overwhelming and awe-inspiring. A great peace settled upon my heart, a deep sense of rest came to me, and overtopping all was a realization of the presence of God as the source of strength. There on that train, when least expected, came an experience which changed my life, a genuine discovery of God. As Bliss Carman writes, perhaps out of a similar transformation, then suddenly, all unaware, I heard God's voice on the air. The reality of that experience could not be shaken by all of the skepticism in the world. Like apt vulgar, I say. Is it supposed to be Abbott? The rest may reason and welcome, but I know. Let them call it unscientific if they wish, or disparaging it in any way they desire. I know beyond the shadow of a doubt that in that moment, or instant of time, the wonder which is God impinged on my spirit and took away all my weakness, all my fears, all my sins, and gave me strength. Now, some theological interpretations you can leave aside and say, well, he had an experience that was based on, right? The secret was that my prayer for once was one of absolute and complete surrender, weary and discouraged by living upon my meager power. I threw myself upon God, saying, anything you want to do with me, O God, is all right. I give my life to thee. I am in thy hands, which is a bit more specific than what you'd expect with people using Ouija boards, because people using Ouija boards are like, do whatever you want with me, to have whatever message and whatever entity, I don't think they say that, but you know what I mean. It's basically, that's the practice of that, the Ouija board thing. I had said that often before and had meant it after a fashion, but the surrender now was not partial but complete. Since then, the high tide of that experience had ebbed and flowed, but the shallows have never reappeared. By a constant daily surrender to God, I have discovered that the divine power is available for my life. I would not exchange this secret for anything in the world. So I say to you, why not try God? It will work for you too if you surrender yourself in childlike faith. And, well, some aspects of childlike faith, because, you can have an informed faith. Perhaps skip to the child stage instead of childlike. But Samuel Harris, I think it is, he says he sounds like he's most against Islam, because Islam is a religion that implies you have to dedicate all your life to God, and it does that more thoroughly, he thinks. And he says that's why he doesn't believe in God, because then he would have to dedicate his whole life like a Muslim or something. If you look at the Bible, there are some things left out, you could say. That's why the culture is different in some ways. Is that, in the Bible, some things were left out and people turned to other things. When I was a teenager, I was into all these UFO books and stuff like that. The music was necessary. Not that I was a fanatic about some sort of band or whatever, but The second reason many of us do not receive help from God is because, frankly, God is not real to us, and he must be if we are to have dealings with him. The theories about God sound good. Academically, we accept them, but they remain for us only theories, no matter what experience others may describe. What can one do that he may himself experience the reality of God in dealing with his problems if we made our relationship to God simpler, less philosophical and theological? It would be more effective and meaningful. The necessity of childlike attitude of man to God cannot be overstressed. For most of us, the idea of God is a great abstraction and a philosophical idea, thin-blooded and lacking in vitality, making God real as a problem with which the greatest minds have struggled. Ages ago, Plato, the consummate figure in the history of philosophy, expressed a deep desire that the moral law might become a living personality of flesh and blood, so that men could become intimately acquainted with its beauty and power. Now, in the Bible, we have the word to be and Mashiach that most fits that. Christios. Omnual. There's other words for prophet, but they don't quite entirely encompass all that, right? Because a chisah is, the vehicle for the vision. Not, it doesn't imply the bringing it out part like Nabi does, or the becoming like Mashiach, or the arbitration like Omnual, or that but it does apply that anointed consciousness, the Christios, but it's George Eliot likewise expressed the thought that great ideas dazzle us without actually laying hold upon our minds. When they appear in a personality, we love them and take them to our hearts. And thus it is evident that we need to acquire a spiritual technique by which we can personalize God in such a way that his reality becomes definite. This has been splendidly illustrated by Leslie D. Wetherhead, who tells us of an old Scotchman who was very ill. His minister called to see him. The old man directed the attention of the minister to the fact that near his bed was a vacant chair, and explained its presence by saying that in his early years he had found it difficult to pray, often falling asleep on his knees, because he was so tired after his day's labor. He said that even if he kept awake, it was often with the greatest difficulty that he kept his thoughts from wandering. He became worried about it and spoke to his minister, who said, "Do not think that you must kneel down to pray. Just sit down," he said, "and put a chair opposite you, and imagine that Jesus is in it, and talk to him as you would to a long-time friend." The Scotchman continued, "I have been doing that ever since, and it works." A week later, the daughter of the old Scot drove up to the minister's house, and when she was shown into his study, sobbed, "Father died in the night. I had no idea death could be so near. I had just gone to lie down for an hour or so. He seemed to be sleeping so comfortably, and when I went back, he was dead. He hadn't moved since I saw him, except that his hand was out on the empty chair by the side of the bed. Isn't that strange?" "No," said the minister. "It is not so strange. I understand. The old man had a great secret. He'd made God an actual factor in his daily life, and living with him in that way had found that it was not a process of imagination, as some might declare it to be, but that God, through the years, had become increasingly a real person to him, and was all along, but accepted as Lord, King, God. Each would be a higher stage of thinking, right, about deity, of humanity. A young man who was making a desperate struggle against an overwhelming temptation with repeated defeats came to me. I advised him to adopt the policy of imagining that Jesus Christ in person was walking by his side, and when the temptation came, to ask Christ to help him overcome it. This, of course, at the start was to him pure imagination. Well, was it? But he told me later that he soon became convinced it was more than imagination, for he clearly felt upon him a restraining hand and the force of a personality that gave him lasting victory. Well, the different parts of yourself react upon stuff, but you get promptings towards each side, right? This experience has happened in the case of too many rational people to be lightly disposed of on the grounds of illusion. Well, no matter how Dionysian or Apollonian you are, something from the other side's going to mix in. What scientific right has any man to say the presence of Christ is not real merely because he has not experienced it? Well, perhaps they experienced Christ, not as a person, but Christ as a concept of anointing. Once, in Wordsworth's garden at Grasmere, I recall that in that place he saw a great sight. Hence, in a season of calm weather, though inland far we be, our souls have sight of that immortal sea, which brought us hither, can in a moment travel thither, and see the children sport upon the shore, and hear the mighty waters rolling evermore. I cannot see that, but who am I to deny the validity of the vision of sharper eyes than mine? And that's one of the things, too, is like to say that nobody could have had an experience that I didn't experience is arrogance or stupidity, or what is it? Once, on a cold day in London, Francis Thompson saw a ladder let down from heaven to Charing Cross, and again, one dark night, he saw Christ walking, not on Gennesaret, but the Thames. I never saw that, but because I may be spiritually dull, must I expect Francis Thompson to be equally so? Well, if it looked like the thing in church, well, the Bible gives a different description of Jesus. But, so it could have been a different figure, or could be something shown to somebody as an individual. Their conception of whatever, just like in a lot of cultures, they see their spiritual master, But I do not argue a philosophical speculation. I state a device for making Christ a real person, a device which has been practiced successfully by so many sensible people that I have no doubt about it at all. Now, that's how some people define yoga. It's a practice. It's a device of consciousness. Why not try God? This is a most insistent question, and is fraught with more significance than any proposition we can consider today. As a matter of fact, it may be not inappropriately termed the question of the hour. America, why not try God? Socially, we have tried many man-conceived devices, both good and bad, with what result? The social machine, despite an apparent business revival, still remains stranded in the deep sands not only of a financial, but a profound spiritual depression. The wheels, spinning violently, have been unable to get a grip on the solid ground that will afford permanent traction. We have assumed that by merely tinkering with the social machinery, a forward motion might be achieved. Some people in discouragement have even thrown down their wrenches and cried loudly that the old machine should be scrapped and a new one created. The old machine is bad enough, to be sure, and surely needs repairing, if not many new parts. This attitude does not take account of the fact, however, that if a new social mechanism laid down to the order of the most punctilious and exacting were built, it would not carry humanity forward without the one vital factor of power. A machine cannot run without power. It may be that we have been erroneously giving our attention to forms when our need is power to endow endless life forms with vitality. Endless isn't one of the words there, but it ought to be ere now obvious that no generation can lift itself for a sustained period by its own bootstraps. It is becoming increasingly evident that we cannot extricate ourselves from this morass by merely fumbling with materialistic processes. Yeah, just don't go through the movements. Our problems are too great for any one mind or any group of minds. If our minds, however, are reinforced by a greater intelligence which is lifted above the dust and confusion of the streets, we shall be endued with power to think clearly and act wisely. Above and beyond that, we should be led by intuitions and insights more discerning and effective than would be allowed by limitations of our apparent capacity. If we hold to the theory that God can work in an individual life, it follows as a logical assumption that he can work in the collective life of mankind. The laws of God's working in individual lives are the laws for his operation in the life of society. If an individual man expects to receive the help of God, he must live the godlike life. Accordingly, a nation desiring the help of God must proceed in its activity on a moral, spiritual, and ethical basis. If we as a people set ourselves to do what is right ethically and spiritually, our world will have a deep tendency to become right. How can we do right, however, human nature being what it is? Here is where God enters the scene. Human nature becomes more than human nature when he assumes control. A lot of the limitations that we think we don't have, or we don't have at some moments, right? And whereas before it was weak and ineffective, it now becomes strong and achieves notable attainments. As the Old Testament has it in a noble line, the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Roger Babson wrote a book some time ago which bears the interesting title, The New Dilemma. In it occurs this strange statement: although few of you believe in heaven and in hell like your grandparents, it was this belief in heaven and hell which made this nation. Mr. Babson does not strictly mean, I assume, that a theological acceptance of the doctrine of heaven or of hell would make or break a nation. What he is saying, I take it, is that a nation succeeds or fails depending upon whether or not it possesses a clearly defined sense of right and wrong. It is a well-known fact that the sharp line of demarcation between right and wrong has been dulled in the mind of the average American in recent years. Well, past few years here have been extreme, right? Like something that over the course of 30 years became 1,000 times more common. They have blended together in our thinking in such a way that many people, frankly, do not know where right ends and wrong begins. Our fathers had no doubt about it, as Mr. Babson indicates, whereas in earlier years, people were either on the side of right or of wrong. Today, most of us are in that vast border country between the two. Got to be careful of those gray areas. Just like, you don't just give so much. You can give a lot of charity, whatever, but you should know whether you're fulfilling your requirements or not. So even in good deeds, you want to be clear. We need to reduce the extent of this border country and sharpen up again the distinction in ethical concepts. That would be accomplished by turning again to God as a spiritual reality. For when God lays hold of a human life, the first thing to happen is a quickening of the instinctive knowledge of the difference between right and wrong. God will help America, therefore, in no magical fashion, but in the practical way of showing us what is right and giving us the power within ourselves to do right. The practical outworking of what is right would, of course, mean a new birth of an unselfish spirit and a wider recognition and application of the Christian principle of human brotherhood. We must discover, ere we have gone much further, that human progress is built not about great ideas, but about great personalities. Fascism, for example, is built not upon the philosophy of that movement, but upon the personalities of Mussolini and Hitler. Well, maybe. Actually, the NSD, the National Socialist, was based on National Socialism, not how great Hitler was. Same thing with Mussolini. Things weren't entirely about the personalities, but hailing them and stuff like that became part of it. Communism, well, communism can be just as left-wing, is not centered half so much about the philosophy of Karl Marx as it is about the personality of Lenin. He gave it life and made it real. So the power to transform and save our time will be not by great ideas, however glorious they may be, but essentially by putting the spirit of the man of Galilee at the center of our common life. And it doesn't matter so much what type of government is, the principles of the people involved and stuff. Then, truly, the world will come out right. How insistent the question is, and with what infinite significance it comes to us. America, why not try God? If we really want America to be great again, sure, there's economic things we can do. We can bring it back to like in the 60s where the average person earned 3 times as much, or at least back to what it was during the Great Depression or something. And, the racial equality of the Civil Rights Act and, the keeping some things to oneself, not requiring it on others to voice support. Also, the Civil Rights era. You there, with the burden of sorrow, why not try God? He understands sorrow. He sent Jesus here, as the Master himself said, to heal the brokenhearted and to set at liberty them that are bruised. He was a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief, and sends to all sorrowing and heavily burdened people a winsome and wonderful invitation. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Sorrow, heartache, the sense of loss, the reality of separation, come to all men impartially. All of us must ultimately bear grief. From it there is no escape, but for it there is a marvelous antidote. The secret is contained in the words, my expectation is from him. So it may be, for he will not fail us. Those who have tried God sincerely have discovered a price less secret, for he steals into their hearts in sorrow, as Bryant has it, with a mild and healing sympathy that steals away its sharpness ere he is aware. Now, if you have compassion upon others, that may sound like, oh, that's the effort, but it's like, no, it somehow makes it worth it. Why not try God? You who have a sin in your life, it is very hard to have a sin on one's soul. Sin is not a fantasy. Tolstoy and Ibsen, 2 of the greatest masters of the human spirit in modern times, substantiated the preacher's emphasis on the reality and terror of sin. It does become, as Ibsen graphically declares, a ghost to haunt a man. A sin in a man's life relentlessly pursues him like some hound of hell. It has ever been so. Aeschylus, generations ago, told the story of Orestes, who committed a sin and later described its pursuit of him in the picturesque phrase, he could not escape from the Furies, the fates, karma, whatever you want to call it, right? But karma's not really a moral term. There can be no abiding peace or happiness in the life of any individual if there is a sin festering within him. Sin comes from the ancient Egyptian sin, mistake, SNN. There is a strange something within us whereby we are haled before a judge in our own soul who convicts us. Yeah, when we come to the judgment, the book, whether it's the left, the right, or behind, or before, or whatever, it's, we're going to know it before, we sit down and, God, where are we, Call this conscious, if you will. It is, nevertheless, a relentless, if withal a fair judge. Every man who has done wrong, and who has not been forgiven, can readily understand the plaintive words of Macbeth, who with a stain of blood upon his hands, and the memory of a crime on his mind, becomes increasingly more frantic and desperate and one day turns to the court physician with this piteous question: Canst thou minister to a mind diseased, pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet, oblivious antidote, cleanse the stuffed bosom from that perilous stuff which weighs upon the heart? The physician sadly shook his head and answered, Therein the patient must minister to himself. I'm sure, however, that Shakespeare, with his shrewd knowledge of men, would agree that the patient cannot really minister to himself. No man is strong enough to take out of his own life the haunting memory and sting of past misdeeds. There is, however, thank God, a great physician who can perform this healing operation. I refer to that physician of souls who, when he places his hand upon the life of a willing patient, draws out of him with sure skill the dark poison which has infected his mind and soul and destroyed the peace and happiness of life. He has done it for many happy men and women throughout the years. He can do it for you. Why not try God? And I don't know what 21133 is. Perhaps it's the company number for the book. To show you the cover once more.